The room was quiet when the final pages of George Burns' will were read aloud, a silence thick with disbelief. For decades, the world had known him as the man who outlived everyone. Friends, rivals, even time itself. He had buried his wife, Gracie Allen, endured the slow disappearance of laughter from his own home, and carried on smiling beneath the weight of a century. Yet the greatest shock did not come from how long he lived, but from what he chose to do when he knew the end was near. His fortune, built from vaudeville stages, radio waves, Hollywood lights, and a career that spanned nearly 80 years, did not go where everyone assumed it would. It did not follow the predictable path of bloodlines or expectations. Instead, it went to one person. A choice that quietly revealed a truth about love, loss, and loyalty that George Burns had never spoken aloud on stage. Why would a man who spent his life making millions laugh make such a deeply personal, almost defiant decision at the very end? And what secret emotional wound does that choice expose about the cost of living too long without the one person who truly understood him? At 91, George Burns woke each morning before the sun, not because he needed to, but because sleep no longer protected him. In the dim light of his Beverly Hills home, the silence arrived first, pressing against the walls like a presence that refused to leave. The laughter that once followed him through studios and theaters had vanished, replaced by the faint sound of his own breathing and the ritual strike of a match against a cigar. The smoke curled upward slowly, filling the room the way memories always did, lingering longer than he wanted. Photographs lined the shelves. Gracie's smile stared back at him from every angle, frozen in mid-laugh, eternal and unreachable. Her voice seemed to echo in the pauses between thoughts, her timing still perfect, even in absence. Burns moved through the house carefully, as if she might be asleep somewhere, as if one wrong sound would confirm what he already knew. This was the cruel contradiction of his final years. A man celebrated everywhere, yet nowhere truly accompanied. Publicly, he remained the miracle. Interviews framed him as indestructible, the man who beat time itself. Cameras captured his jokes, his charm, his easy grin. What they never captured was the moment after the lights dimmed, when he sat alone and wondered why he was still here. Survivor's guilt settled into his chest like a permanent ache. Friends were gone. Rivals were gone. Gracie was gone. The question followed him relentlessly. What kind of life keeps taking without mercy, and why had it spared him? Legal papers waited on his desk, neat and final. Names, numbers, signatures. A lifetime reduced to documents and decisions. Advisors spoke in calm voices about responsibility and tradition, about what people would expect. Burns listened, nodded, and said very little. Inside, something older and deeper was guiding him, a memory of devotion, of loyalty proven not by blood, but by presence when the world grew quiet. Late at night, he stared at the papers alone. The cigar burned down to ash as he imagined the moment those pages would be read aloud. He knew the shock it would cause. He knew the headlines it would invite. But this was not a performance, not a punchline. It was a confession he had never allowed himself to speak. When he finally signed his name, his hand did not tremble. The decision felt heavy, but clean, like closing a door that had been left open too long. Somewhere in the stillness, the last echo of laughter faded, replaced by something truer and far more dangerous. The certainty that his final act would force the world to question who truly mattered to him, and why. Outside, the city slept, unaware that an unseen verdict had already been written. The choice would outlive him, stirring arguments, hurt, and disbelief. It would reopen old wounds and expose hidden bonds. And as dawn approached, one question waited silently. Who was the one person he trusted with everything? The answer would haunt history. Long before the world knew him as George Burns, before the cigars and the applause and the illusion of permanence, he was Nathan Birnbaum, a small boy growing up in the crowded, unforgiving streets of New York City. His childhood did not unfold gently. It arrived in fragments. Thin walls, anxious whispers, the constant awareness that stability was a luxury his family could not afford. Poverty was not an idea. It was a daily pressure that shaped how he spoke, how he moved, how he learned to watch people carefully. The defining wound came early. His father's death was not dramatic or cinematic, but abrupt and absolute. One day there was a presence, a fragile sense of order. The next, there was absence. That absence carved itself into Nathan's psychology with brutal efficiency. From that moment on, the world felt unreliable, capable of removing anything without warning. Childhood ended quietly. Responsibility took its place. His mother struggled to hold the family together, and Nathan absorbed her fear without understanding it fully. He learned that survival meant adaptation. He sold newspapers. He sang on street corners. He watched faces, what made people stop, what made them smile, what made them listen. Comedy was not joy yet. It was currency. If he could make strangers laugh, he could eat. If he could hold attention, he could exist. Emotionally, something else was forming beneath the surface. A deep, unspoken terror of being left behind. Of loving something that would disappear. He never articulated it, but it guided his instincts. He learned to keep moving forward, never settling long enough to feel safe. Stillness felt dangerous. Silence felt like loss. On makeshift stages and cheap venues, Nathan discovered a strange power. Laughter gave him control over chaos. For a few minutes he could dictate emotion, bend reality, silence fear. But the cost was internal. The boy who learned to perform also learned to hide. Pain was buried beneath timing. Fear beneath charm. The habit would follow him into adulthood, into fame, into love. Years later, when Gracie Allen entered his life, it felt unfamiliar and terrifying. She did not leave. She stayed. She saw past the performance and remained anyway. That kind of loyalty touched the deepest, most fragile part of him, the child who had learned not to trust permanence. And though he embraced that love fully, a quiet voice inside never stopped preparing for the moment it might be taken away. As this chapter closes, the foundation is set. The world sees a future legend in the making. What it does not see is the boy still standing on a cold street corner, watching everything closely, learning that nothing lasts forever, and promising himself he would never again be powerless when it disappeared. By the time George Burns reached the height of his fame, the world believed he was untouchable. His face was familiar in every living room, his voice trusted, his presence comforting. Stages welcomed him like an old friend returning home. Laughter rose on cue, reliable and loud, wrapping around him like armor. From the outside, his life looked complete. Success stacked neatly upon success, longevity already defying expectation. But fame, for all its warmth, never learned how to stay once the lights went out. Behind the curtain, Gracie Allen was the constant. Not simply a partner, but a stabilizing force that gave shape to his inner world. She understood his rhythms, his pauses, the spaces between his jokes where the truth lived. With her, he did not need to perform. Their home was filled with a different kind of sound, soft conversations, shared silences, an intimacy built over decades. For the first time in his life, the boy who feared disappearance believed he might be safe. Then time began to interfere. Illness arrived slowly, cruel in its patience. Hospital rooms replaced familiar stages. The lighting was harsher, the laughter absent. Burns watched Gracie fade in increments, each day stealing something small but irreplaceable. He stayed composed, outwardly steady, but inside the old fear awakened fully. This was the loss he had been preparing for since childhood, and no amount of fame could soften its approach. After she was gone, the applause returned, but it sounded different. Hollow, distant. He went back to work almost immediately, not out of strength, but necessity. Performance became refuge again. On stage, grief waited politely in the wings. Off stage, it overwhelmed him. Nights stretched longer. The house felt larger, emptier. He spoke to her photograph without realizing it, pausing as if expecting an answer. Psychologically, Burns entered a dangerous balance. He was celebrated everywhere, yet emotionally unanchored. People assumed he was resilient, that humor had saved him. What they missed was how much energy it took to keep moving, to keep smiling, to keep pretending that loss had not fractured something essential. Fame offered admiration, not companionship. Could fill theaters, not rooms. As years passed, he began to think differently about meaning. Awards felt lighter. Money felt abstract. What mattered now was presence, who stayed when nothing was required of them, who listened without expectation, who remained when laughter failed. These questions followed him quietly, reshaping how he viewed his life's work and its eventual end. In moments of solitude, he began to imagine a future without him. What would remain once the performances stopped forever? Whose hands would hold the weight of what he left behind? The answers forming in his mind were unexpected, unsettling, and deeply personal. As the chapter closes, the contradiction sharpens. A man adored by millions, yet emotionally exposed, surrounded by praise, yet starving for genuine connection. Somewhere between the spotlight and the silence, George Burns began preparing for a final decision, one that would reveal where he truly found shelter when fame could no longer protect him. The decision did not arrive in a single moment. It formed slowly, shaped by nights of reflection and mornings heavy with memory. George Burns sat at his desk as sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating papers that carried far more weight than their thin pages suggested. This was not business. This was reckoning. Every name represented a relationship, every omission a truth he could no longer avoid. Advisors spoke carefully, their voices measured, rehearsed. They outlined expectations as if they were laws of nature. Family lines, public image, tradition. Burns listened without interruption, his face calm, his posture relaxed, the familiar mask firmly in place. Inside, however, a quiet resistance was growing. He had spent a lifetime performing for others. This, he knew, would be the one moment where performance no longer mattered. He thought about absence, about who had disappeared when youth faded, when grief became inconvenient, when he was no longer useful or entertaining. He thought about presence, about the person who answered the phone late at night, who sat with him in silence without trying to fix anything, who understood that behind the jokes was a man still carrying an old, unfinished sadness. Loyalty, he realized, had nothing to do with blood. It had everything to do with staying. When he finally spoke, the room shifted. The choice he stated did not fit the narrative people expected from a cultural icon. There was no explanation offered, no justification. He did not argue. He simply insisted. This was where his life pointed when stripped of illusion. This was where his gratitude lived. Signing the will felt strangely peaceful. Not triumphant, not defiant, honest. It was an act of emotional accuracy, not generosity. He understood the shock it would cause. He accepted the misunderstanding that would follow. Burns had lived long enough to know that truth often looks offensive when it refuses to follow tradition. Later, alone again, he sat with the quiet certainty of what he had done. The laughter of the world no longer concerned him. What mattered was that, for once, his inner life and his outward legacy were aligned. This was not a joke. It was not a twist. It was a final statement about who had mattered when everything else fell away. As the chapter closes, the consequences hover unseen. Headlines have yet to be written. Judgments have yet to be made. One question lingers in the silence he leaves behind. When the world finally learns who inherited everything, will it understand that this choice was never about money, but about who truly stayed when time took almost everyone else? When George Burns died, the world reacted the way it always had, with affection, nostalgia, and applause that arrived a few moments too late. Tributes poured in, replaying his jokes, his timing, the impossible fact that he had lived past 100. The public story was neat and celebratory. A man who made the world laugh for generations. A life well lived. But beneath that polished farewell, another story quietly demanded to be acknowledged. The will was read. The surprise landed. Confusion followed admiration, and admiration turned, in some cases, to resentment. Commentators searched for logic where there was only emotion. Analysts debated fairness, entitlement, expectation. But George Burns was no longer present to clarify, and perhaps that was intentional. He had never believed everything important needed explaining. In the stillness after the noise, His life looked different when viewed as a whole. A child shaped by loss, a man sustained by partnership, an old soul who survived too long for comfort. Longevity, once celebrated as victory, revealed itself as endurance. To live that long was to watch everyone else leave in stages, to accumulate grief the way others accumulate memories. His final decision reframed everything. It exposed the truth that laughter had always been a tool, not the destination. That behind the cigar smoke and punchlines lived a man who valued constancy over tradition, presence over obligation. The person he chose was not a scandal, it was a mirror, a reflection of who had stood beside him when the rooms grew quiet, when applause stopped meaning anything at all. Gracie's absence remained the defining wound, but it also clarified something essential. Love, once experienced deeply, becomes the standard by which everything else is measured. Burns could not leave his legacy to an idea, a name, or a rule. He left it to what felt real, to what had carried him through the final stretch of a very long road. In the end, his legacy was not written in money or fame. It lived in the uncomfortable questions his choice forced others to ask. Who stays when there is nothing left to gain? Who matters when performance ends? What does loyalty look like when stripped of expectation? George Burns did not answer those questions directly. He never had to. He answered them with silence, with ink on paper, with a final act that spoke louder than any joke he ever told. And as the laughter faded into history, what remained was something rarer and far more enduring. A portrait of a man who, after a lifetime of entertaining the world, chose honesty at the very end, even if it meant being misunderstood forever.